embedded there. Chelsea Handler tweeted something out really insane about the Second Amendment the other day. Here's what it looked like. She tweeted, "My armed guards aren't killing children and don't have semi-automatic weapons," because she was asked about being ignorant of the Constitution and not knowing anything about how the Constitution works. So somebody tweeted, "Get rid of your armed guards and then you can talk to the middle class about feeling safe." And she said, "My armed guards aren't killing children and don't have semi-automatic weapons." Okay, first of all, I would guarantee that her armed guards have semi-automatic weapons and she doesn't know what a semi-automatic weapon is. That's number one. Because every armed guard I have ever worked with has a semi-automatic weapon. You know why? Because virtually every pistol in the United States is a semi-automatic weapon. Unless they're carrying a revolver, unless they're carrying like an old-style Dirty Harry Colt 45, it's a semi-automatic weapon. Second of all, guess who else isn't killing children? Anyone else who has a semi-automatic weapon in the United States and is not the shooter in Parkland. And so it's all fun and games for Chelsea Handler because I guess only her armed guards are apparently the only people in the United States who have semi-automatic weapons who are not murdering children. Apparently, amazing. I mean, good for her that she found the 5 guys in America with semi-automatic weapons who aren't shooting children. What an amazing feat. It's not that there are millions of Americans who own semi-automatic weapons and use them to defend their children and not to shoot children. No, it's that Chelsea Handler's people are just the best people. They're just the best people. And then they wonder why we don't trust them on Second Amendment issues. They won't when they've got spokespeople like Chelsea Handler and condom snorting teenagers. Not to suggest the kids at Parkland are doing that, but again, the youth of America, there's some questions to be asked. That's all I'm saying. Okay, so Federalist paper. So every week we go through a Federalist paper. We are now up to Federalist 22. Alexander Hamilton wrote Federalist number 22, and this Federalist paper continues with the flaws of the current Articles of Confederation that was replaced by the Constitution of the United States. He makes several criticisms of the Articles of Confederation in this particular Federalist paper. First, he says, we need a system that does not allow internal tariffs or allow various parts of the country to refuse to abide by foreign tariff rules. So in other words, you need a federal government that can set tariff policy, and you can't have states that override it. Otherwise, none of the tariff policies that you actually impose are going to be workable. If you work a deal with Great Britain to lower your trade barriers, and then South Carolina says, we're going to set up our own tariff, well, then why exactly would Britain negotiate with the United States as opposed to just negotiating with each individual state, thereby separating them off from the mother country? He says also, under the Articles of Confederation, the way that the army was summoned was by going to particular states and requesting that they send men. This actually did not work well during the American Revolution. And he says this actually created a system of bidding where particular states, knowing they had to submit a certain number of men, would actually just put out a price, a wage price for particular soldiers, and people would leave their home state and go to the other state because they knew that they were going to be able to be called up there and get paid a higher price. Also, Hamilton says that we can't have a system that's completely like the U.S. Senate, where it's equal representation for every state and then a 2/3 majority to decide things, because then nothing will get done. Instead, he says that we need a majority, at least one house, that's a House of Representatives, where population is represented in the number of representatives. And then finally, he suggests that we also need a judiciary capable of interpreting the laws and treaties. And he says that if we don't have a judiciary that is going to interpret those laws and treaties from the federal level, then again, that allows state courts to basically stand as an obstacle to federal policy. The most important thing that happens in this Federalist paper, Federalist 22, is what he says at the very end. What he says is that the Constitution of the United States is to be approved by the people themselves. And this is why we the people is the beginning of the Constitution of the United States. And the reason for that, and the reason this is important, is because one of the arguments in the Civil War was that once the federal government had violated the sovereignty of particular states, those states were signatories to the Constitution, and therefore they no longer had to abide by it, right? That the contract against the states had been violated, and so states had the ability and the right to pull out. This is what they called compact theory, that the Constitution was a compact between the states. It was not actually a compact of the people. Hamilton, foreseeing this problem in 1789, that never should happen to anybody of decency, happened to David Hogg, and that's awful and unforgivable. But he's now in the political debate, and that means that there's some slings and arrows that come with the political debate. I know this, okay? When I was 17 years old, the same age as David Hogg, I started writing a syndicated column, and I got clubbed about the ears for it. And a lot of that was deserved, because guess what? At 17, you don't know everything, and sometimes your perspectives are wrong. And if you join in the political debate, then it is open season on your politics. And by the way, it's not to be gauche. Like, insults are bad. People saying silly, stupid things about you, that's nasty. But it does happen on a relatively regular basis. Okay, for years, I was called the Virgin Ben in the left-wing press. Okay, that is not a joke. From the time I was 17, there were people who were calling me the Virgin Ben because obviously I was a nerd who had never had sex. And I was proud about the fact that I hadn't had sex, and I was a virgin until I was married. But I was called the Virgin Ben. Not once did I ever call for the people who are calling me the Virgin Ben to lose their advertising base. And my retaliatory response was, guns are a tool just like anything else. And the reality is that the states with the lowest gun homicide rate in the nations are, in order, New Hampshire, Vermont, Iowa, Idaho, North Dakota, and Montana. None of those states have significant gun laws. None of them. The reason for that is because the folks who live in those states are different than the folks who live in states with high rates of gun crime. If you actually want to solve the problem of gun crime, you have to solve the underlying problem with it, which is crime. Right? And instead of focusing on the implement that is used to commit the crime, we need to be focused on how we actually get the crime rates down. The truth is that one of the reasons that you've seen such tremendous declines in crime in some of the states that you mentioned, Ralph, is because across the country, we've seen a tremendous decline in the amount of crime in the country. We've actually seen tremendous declines in domestic violence, domestic assault across the country over the last 20 years. In terms of intimate partner violence, we've seen a decline of 72%. I mean, these are massive drops, and one of the reasons for that is not increased gun laws. Gun laws have actually been loosened in many cases, especially at the federal level. The reason for that is because you've actually seen longer sentences for criminals. I don't understand why we don't have an alternative in terms of actually fighting crime itself. I mean, what we are doing is we are creating a whole new class of crime in which an enormous number of people who are not committing crimes other than transferring a weapon to, for example, a sister-in-law could theoretically be swept up by a prosecutor in that. Now, we've been assured by people that they are not going to apply the law as written in cases where they don't feel that it's necessary to do so. But really, I mean, this... This initiative is vague. It is poorly defined. The definitions are poor. There are many holes in it. And the best that the state seems to be doing with I-94 is, well, trust us, we'll enforce it right. And if that were the case, if that were the case, if we could trust the state to enforce things correctly, then we wouldn't have half of the problems with violence in the state that we currently have. So, Ralph, let me ask this. Why does I-94 have to be an omnibus? Really, it's an 18-page bill. If we agree on all of these very minor measures, then why not start with the minor measures upon which we agree? Why is it loaded up like a shopping cart with measures with which a lot of people disagree?
What do you think it's loaded up? We're going to get into transfers, right?
Well, yes. I mean, okay. the definition, I mean, I don't want to get into the weeds because we talked about this earlier, but yes, the definition of transfer is incredibly vague in the bill.
So a couple of things about transfers on that. And one, this bill was modeled after Oregon and California, which have had...
Being from California, it's worked beautifully.
Which has had hundreds of thousands of background checks, and there hasn't been one instance of somebody put in jail for a transfer. Secondly, the key thing on a transfer is that you have to knowingly circumvent the law. In other words, you have to be a black market dealer. Or otherwise, you're not going to be criminalized for it. That transfer issue is put in there to affect this individual at a gun show. So gun shows are private sales. You can sell a couple of guns, but you had black market dealers that were selling 50 AK-47s a session against the law. Those people should have been, by definition, federally licensed firearm dealers. So it's designed at some point to prevent the bad guys from doing it. It's not a gotcha. Nobody wants gotcha for the average everyday citizen put in jail, and it will not happen that way because we have precedent in California and Oregon.
Well, it should be, okay, let me tell you a little bit about the precedent in California for a second. In California, there are 30,000 mentally ill people who have guns. They have a grand total of 33 people, really, in the state of California who are tasked with taking these 30,000 guns away from these 30,000 mentally ill people. Okay, we're creating a system that is either not going to be enforced or it's going to be over-enforced. This idea, if we can just trust the government, then why aren't we just trusting the government to do the right thing now? I don't understand why a piece of legislation makes them better at what they do. I mean, the government is not very good at what they're doing now. Why does new wording make them not suck?
Because part of the reason you have a law or initiative as a deterrent, that government won't even be involved, that the bad guys won't be going to gun shows to buy guns, so they have to circumvent it.
Well, but that's exactly the point. If bad guys are not going to gun shows with regard to Ebola, and for a second, this is a mild digression. With regard to Ebola, the federal government just made the case that they don't want a federal travel ban, right? Because they said if there's a federal travel ban, people will just find a way to circumvent the federal travel ban. Okay, do you see the analogy here?
Yeah, I'm not going there. I'm not going there. I'm here to talk about guns. And most people are law-abiding citizens on that. So, I think one of the reasons you have laws is a deterrent to make sure that people do the right thing.
Well, I agree, but this is the attendant cost. Right? If there are law-abiding, the cost is a law-abiding citizen, for example, under the bill, who wants to loan a gun to a family member for purposes of defending themselves. The bill talks about it has to be in the case only of the most basically emergency situations. Well, how does the government define that? It's undefined in the bill. Right? I mean, so I have a cousin or I have a sister-in-law who feels endangered by her husband. If I give her the gun, and she says, I feel endangered, and she keeps it for a week, but the government only decides that she was endangered for 3 days, and the gun is stolen and used, then she can be prosecuted, I can be prosecuted, as well as the criminal.
And you'll never be prosecuted. It's never happened.
So again, it comes down to faith in government.
You'll never be prosecuted. There's precedent here. You'll never be prosecuted. Use your best judgment and don't knowingly break the law.
Then why don't we just pass a referendum that says, please, prosecutors, do good stuff?